I want to talk about a certain way of thinking about pleasure. And then I want to suggest that this could help us understand a problem in everyday life, a problem that I would bet everybody in this room struggles with. The perspective is something I developed in my book a few years ago, How Pleasure Works. And the main idea could be summarized as pleasure is deep. What I mean by that is that even the most seemingly superficial pleasures, like sexual orgasm or sipping a glass of wine, is actually deep in a sense that it's powerfully influenced by your beliefs about what you are experiencing. So for instance, one example is these are attractive faces. We've done studies, people rank these as attractive faces. But how attractive you find them depends critically on who you think you're looking at. You probably think the person on the left is male and the person on the right is female. If that belief turns out to be wrong, it'll make a difference. It makes a difference how much you like the person. Married couples in good relationships each tend to think that their partner is far better looking than anyone else thinks they are. It's not like the woman says, oh, my husband, I love him, but he looks like a toad. Rather, if you love him, he doesn't look like a toad anymore. Or take wine. So one source of pleasure of wine is, of course, the chemical composition of what you're drinking. But we also know that what you think you're drinking will powerfully influence your experience, and in particular, how expensive you think the wine is. This has been done many ways. Most recently, it's been done in an fMRI scanner. So they get subjects to lie in the scanner, they sip wine through a tube, and while they're sipping wine through a tube, on a screen in front of them is information about what they're drinking. Everybody is, of course, drinking the same wine. But if they think they're drinking cheap stuff, parts of the brain devoted to sensory pleasure lie dormant. While if they think they're drinking expensive stuff, it lights up like a Christmas tree. Another domain is consumer products. So people value these, they get pleasure from these objects, and any economist will tell you one reason they give pleasure is through their utility, what they could do for you. So you could wear shoes on your feet, you could play golf with golf clubs, and chewed up bubble gum doesn't do anything for you. But each of these three objects gives pleasure for reasons above and beyond their utility because of what people know about their history. The golf clubs were owned by John F. Kennedy and sold at auction for $750,000. The bubble gum was chewed by Britney Spears and sold on eBay for a couple of $100s. And the shoes may be the most valuable of all. According to a New York Times report, a Saudi millionaire offered $10 million for that pair of shoes. And these were the shoes thrown at George Bush at an Iraqi press conference. Now, with my collaborators at Yale, we started to explore what sort of history influences pleasure. So we did a study where we asked people, name the living person in the world who's famous and who you most admire and most respect. And some people answered George Clooney. So we said, okay, how much would you pay for a sweater that was owned and worn by George Clooney? And the answer is a fair amount. I'll pay more for this sweater than I'll pay for a sweater that's brand new or a sweater that's owned by me or somebody else. And then we did various experiments to pull apart what's giving the sweater the value. So for another group of subjects, we said, you could buy the sweater, but you're forbidden from reselling it. And you can't tell anybody you own it. You can't boast about it. And actually, that causes the value. People will pay a little bit less, suggesting boasting value, resale value matters. But what really has an effect is you tell people, you can buy the sweater, you can boast about it, you can resell it, but before it gets to you, it's thoroughly washed. Now the value drops substantially. As my wife put it, you've washed away the Clooney cooties. We did a variant of this experiment where now we didn't ask people, somebody they admire, says, who's the famous person who you hate the most in the world, who disgusts you? And so some people said Bernie Madoff. And we redid the same experiment, and we found the results flipped. So some people don't want Bernie Madoff's sweater at all. Other people will actually spend quite a bit of money on it. But if they're told they can't resell it or boast about it, they don't want it anymore. While this time, if it's thoroughly washed, it goes up slightly in value, not down. Then, in collaboration with George Newman, we took it out of the lab and into the real world, and we actually looked at auction data to see how much do people pay for the stuff that goes under auction. And what we did was we factored out everything else, and we just looked at the effect of bodily contact. How much does it make contact with a person's body? And what we found was, for beloved celebrities, like the Kennedys and Marilyn Monroe, contact with the body makes its value go up. while for somebody like Bernie Madoff, whose stuff was recently sold at auction, it has a small but significant effect in the opposite direction. The biggest case where history matters in our experience comes from the pleasure we get from artwork. So this is the Supper at Emmaus. When it was thought to be painted by Vermeer, it was one of the most popular paintings in all of Europe. People came from all around the world to see it. And then one terrible day, it was discovered to be a forgery by Han van Meegeren, and it was immediately taken away from the museum. It lost all of its value. And when it comes to the pleasure we get from an artistic object, artistic performance, we resonate very much to what we believe its history is. So here's another example. This is a work by Jackson Pollock. Who here likes Jackson Pollock? Who here doesn't? Does nothing for you? Okay, I have nothing to say about who's right, but what I'll suggest is the pleasure you get from the Pollock depends critically on how difficult you think it was to make. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that the harder you think it is to create something, the more pleasure you get out of it, the more you enjoy it. As another example of how history matters, consider the modernist composer John Cage at his most famous composition, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. As some of you know, this involves somebody going up to a piano, sitting down, opening up the piano, and sitting there doing nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Now, people could disagree about what they think of the composition, but what strikes me as fascinating is you can buy it on iTunes. Now, Mike mentioned the comment section. If you want to see people arguing about it, see the discussions over here where people are screaming, "You're spending money for 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. Just sit there." And then other people respond, "No, I want to hear that silence." So history matters. And this brings us to the puzzle I want to raise. People in the first world, people in the Western world, get immense amount of pleasure from movies, television shows, music, and books. You take all those pleasures and the time we spend on them, and it's way more than all other pleasures put together. But recently, we've had a revolution in how we can experience these pleasures. So this is my study at home. This is my computer. And on this computer, I can watch thousands, probably millions of movies. Virtually any movie I could think of, I could watch for a small fee. Same with television shows. Same with music. I could listen to any song I could think of. I could type it in and there it will come up on Spotify or YouTube or iTunes. For books, if I want a book, I could just type it in my iPad and then I have the book. If my 12-year-old self knew that in the future he'd be doing this, he would say, "Wow, that's amazing. You must be very happy." The puzzle is, I'm actually not very happy. In fact, I often sit on my computer at night, faced with this staggering bounty of potential pleasure, and I check my email, and I look myself up on Google. And, you know, okay, so maybe you say, this is, I'm just autobiography, I'm weird, fine. But it's not just me. So this is a graph of happiness United States from 46 to 2006. As you could imagine, a lot has happened there. Some world wars, recessions, stock market booms, transformations in the role of women and treatment of African Americans and homosexuals. And among all of these changes, what I'm talking about, the increase in easy access to all of these pleasures. So around that period, we get the founding of Google, of Netflix, and of iTunes. And here's how it affected our happiness. Not at all. So that's kind of a puzzle. And so one way to frame the puzzle is we now can experience some of the pleasures we most enjoy, and we have an enormous amount of choice, and we have little or no effort. And I think that the reason why this doesn't give us as much pleasure as we might want is because there are two problems with this situation. One is there's an enormous amount of choice, and the second is there's little or no effort. So we know from the work of psychologists like Barry Schwartz that there exists something called a paradox of choice. That once you go beyond a small number of options, too much choice makes you miserable. People faced with large numbers of choices find it harder to choose. They are anxious about choosing. They'd rather not choose. And once they've chosen, they're less happy with their decision, presumably because they could then regret. They have the possibility of regret. I could have chosen something better, and I have nobody to blame but myself. As for effort, there's some very elegant work suggesting that the amount of effort you put into something, that aspect of the history of an object, leads to, powerfully influences the pleasure that you get from it. And actually, my favorite study here was done by Mike Norton and Dan Ariely and their colleagues, where they get people to build something. And then later, they're asked how much do they value it, how much will they pay for it. And this is compared to the very same object, except they didn't build it. And it turns out that creating it, putting the time into it, radically increases the amount of pleasure people receive from it, something that they describe as the IKEA effect. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, there's a couple of solutions, but they are not easy solutions. So one is we can give up these easy pleasures. We can shut ourselves away from the internet. We can listen to our music from records. We can go to movies. We can take out our books from the library. But we no longer make it so easy for ourselves. A second one is we can offload choices. So like Neo in the Matrix, we could find an advisor or an oracle to choose for us, giving up our freedom to choose as a way of enhancing our pleasure. Both of these are cases of what philosophers describe as self-binding. So self-binding is a case where we act now to narrow our choices or our abilities in the future. And a classic example of this is Ulysses, who demanded that his sailors bind him to the mast so he can listen to the song of the sirens, but be forbidden from going into the water after them. Now, self-binding is often described in terms of the satisfaction of long-term goals, such as losing weight, or not being sexually unfaithful, or not drinking and driving, where we know what we're tempted to do and we try to block it. But I think that is also central to solving this puzzle. So self-binding is not easy. You see from his expression, he's not a happy man. It requires forethought, it requires intelligence, and it requires extraordinary discipline. But I think it is the only possible solution to the paradox of pleasure that we all face. Thank you.
So, a couple of questions. So, first of all, so you talked a lot about how an object gain history and knowledge. We did a study a while ago. We made a new word for shaving. We call it smoothability. And we taught people what smoothability means, and we got our students to shave. Some of them knew what smoothability was and some not, for 6 weeks. And then the people who learned about this new world loved shaving more and willing to pay more for a razor. It struck me that one of the possibilities is to say about how do you give back a history of an object. Maybe when the search is too simple and you just consume it, you're not getting enough of the background and history. Could you think that this could be another part of the solution where we just basically inject more meaning into the object and therefore get people to consume them in a broader sense?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So when you start looking for examples like this, they're all over the place. Food tastes a lot better if it's being served by somebody who loves you than if you're eating it while running through an airport. Mm-hmm. It's the same chemicals, but it's a different experience. So there's a third version of self-binding I didn't get to, which is savoring and understanding. So the way to enjoy wine more isn't just to get a lot of expensive bottles and start drinking like crazy. It's take a wine tasting course and learn to experience it. The way to experience a movie more or a song more is to sort of understand it more, but also to savor it. But again, that's difficult because I don't need to, we have this easy, immediate access. Yep. So I think you're right, but I think that that's still a need for self-binding.
Last question. What do you do personally to derive more pleasure?
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. I actually try to understand things more. I have taken wine tasting courses. I've taken beer tasting courses. It's very simple. It's just cold, it's good. But still, and I've tried to learn more about music and about movies. And I find that because I learn more about movies, I see a movie, oh, I see what they're doing there, and then it enhances my pleasure.
Very good. Thank you very
so
much.